Imagine walking through a quiet village in northern Poland, and suddenly, the excavations to widen a simple street reveal something dark. Remains. Not of ordinary people, but of 450 bodies buried with signs of strange practices. Luzino, 2023. What these excavations uncovered shook not only the small local community but all of Poland. Could these discoveries be connected to ancient vampire legends haunting the Pieniny Mountains? Myth or reality? Today, we're diving into the intriguing and chilling story of these supposed vampires, buried centuries ago with practices that defy understanding. Prepare yourself for a journey of mystery, culture, and darkness, where Polish folklore blends with reality in an enigma that will keep you hooked until the end. The dense fog surrounding the Pieniny Mountains that morning seemed thicker than usual, as if the mountains themselves were trying to hide a secret too old to be revealed. The air held an uncomfortable silence, interrupted only by the muffled sound of shovels cutting through the earth. It was the kind of silence that whispers forgotten stories and disturbs the souls of those who dare to listen. The team of archaeologists didn't know they were about to uncover something that neither time nor fear had completely erased. As layers of earth were removed, the first traces emerged. Bones. But these were not just any bones. Each skeleton, buried in a disordered position, had its mouth grotesquely filled with stones. Surrounding them were signs of ancient rituals, crushed skulls and stakes driven through hearts. This was no ordinary cemetery, but a silent battlefield between human fear and something much older, something that refused to die. The air around seemed to grow colder as the archaeologists, speechless, continued to dig. The fog enveloped the site like a veil, as if time itself was conspiring to keep this secret buried. Each bone extracted from the soil seemed to carry the weight of centuries, a reminder that the past, no matter how hard we try, can never be fully buried. It was as if the mountains were alive, watching, whispering their warnings through the icy wind passing between twisted trees. With each new discovery, the sense of unease grew among the team members. There were 450 skeletons, each bearing clear signs of anti-vampire rituals. But who were these people? And why the desperate need to prevent them from coming back to life? The faces of the archaeologists, lit only by the dim light of dusk, expressed both fascination and terror. It was as if the past was finally demanding to be heard, as if these souls could no longer rest in silence. Night began to fall, and with it came an inescapable sense of unease. The shadows of the trees lengthened, while the wind seemed to carry something deeper than just cold. The archaeologists, once skeptical and rational, now felt the presence of something invisible, something that transcended logic. The science they held in their hands could not explain what they felt in their hearts. There was a story here, a story of blood, fear, and betrayal, and it was about to be unearthed. As the stars timidly appeared in the sky above, the truth seemed ever more distant and mysterious. The Pieniny Mountains kept their answers. What were they really? What did this discovery mean? Were they victims of a legend, or monsters that once walked among us? The icy wind blowing through the Pieniny Mountains carries more than just the piercing cold of the heights. It carries murmurs, fragments of voices long lost in time, whispered words that echo from deep within the earth. It's as if the soil itself has memories, relics of a time that humanity insists on burying, but that refuses to be forgotten. The 450 vampires are not merely decomposed bodies. They are living witnesses of an endless cycle of darkness and light, of secrets that persist across the centuries. In the village at the foot of the mountains, the elders speak of a time when fear wasn't limited to the unknown, but to what was all too familiar. They remember stories told by their grandparents, of moonless nights when the silence was so dense it was almost suffocating. On those nights, the past awoke, not as a fleeting ghost, but as a force manifesting in the breath of the wind, in the subtle movements of the trees, in shadows that shouldn't exist. And over time, the past didn't leave, it simply hid, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The archaeologists who uncovered the graves didn't understand at first what they had unearthed. To them, these were just ancient bones, evidence of an unknown burial practice. But as they dug deeper, not only into the ground but into the layers of history, they began to realize they were disturbing something far more dangerous. Something that should have remained dormant. And what was once dead, or thought to be, was now beginning to awaken a silent shadow, eager to reclaim its place in the world. The vampires, as described in the legends, were not merely bloodthirsty predators. They were a living reminder of the pact between man and night, a covenant sealed not with words, but with sacrifices. The land of the Pieniny Mountains was not just their burial ground, it was their sanctuary. And now, having been exposed again to the light of day, the balance had been broken. Reality was beginning to give way, fragmenting as the past refused to die. And the more was revealed, the darker the present became. The surrounding villages were already starting to feel the effects. Children disappearing, sheep found drained of blood. The villagers looked at the archaeologists with fear, as if they knew the scientists had unleashed something that reason could neither understand nor control. The bones in the graves were not just bones. They were marks of a time when good and evil were not abstract concepts, but tangible forces that walked alongside humanity, invisible but always present. The past refused to be buried again, moving through time, finding its way back to the present with every breath, every whisper. And now, who will have the courage to face what was once defeated, but never truly destroyed? The past is here, alive, walking beside the living, defying death and proving that it is not always the end. For those who listen, there is always a choice: to ignore the whispers or to dive into them, to face the shadows or be consumed by them. And as the Pieniny Mountains remain silent, their secret grows, waiting to be unleashed. Don't forget to subscribe. On this channel, we'll have a series of videos on enigmatic mysteries like this one. The Pieniny Mountains have an almost supernatural presence, with their steep slopes and deep valleys. During the day, their serene beauty hides what lies in their shadows. But at night, silence takes over. A silence that doesn't bring peace, but unease. It's not the kind of quiet that soothes the spirit, but a charged stillness, where it feels like something or someone is lurking, watching, waiting. The 450 vampires buried there seem to be just the tip of the iceberg, a long-buried secret, as deep as the mountain's roots. There is something insidious about the way evil hides in the Pieniny. It doesn't manifest directly, like a predator attacking its prey. Instead, it moves slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a cold breeze that brushes the skin yet leaves a feeling of deep discomfort. The inhabitants of the surrounding villages, who have lived there for generations, have learned not to ignore this evil. They feel its presence, even if they don't see it. The eyes of the elders carry a painful wisdom, an understanding of what it means to live in the shadow of these mountains. For centuries, the stories about vampires in the Pieniny were told as warnings. Children were cautioned not to wander at night. Fires were kept burning, not just to ward off the cold, but to keep away what the moonlight might attract. But there was something more to these stories, something deeper. A silent malevolence that seemed to permeate every stone, every tree, every breath of wind. The vampires, as the legends whispered, were not just creatures of the night but guardians of a greater evil, something sealed beneath the earth of the mountains. Modern scholars, even the most skeptical, cannot explain what happens in the Pieniny. The peculiar magnetism of the place, the inexplicable disturbances in electronic devices, the sudden rise in cases of mysterious illnesses among those who venture too close to the ancient graves. To science, these are coincidences. But to those who know the region's history, it's a warning. The evil in the mountains is patient. It waits for the right moment to manifest. And the vampires, once imprisoned by fear of the light, now move between dusk and dawn, silently, without haste. The first signs that something was wrong didn't come from the opened graves, but from the nearby villages. A hunting dog was found dead, its body drained of blood. A few days later, an elderly woman disappeared without a trace. And then came the dreams. Dreams shared by many, where the mountains seemed alive, pulsing with a dark energy. At first, people thought it was just coincidence. But as the disappearances increased and the darkness seemed to draw closer to their doorsteps, the old stories began to seem less like legends and more like forgotten warnings. The evil in the Pieniny doesn't need to scream to be heard. It whispers, slides through the trees, hides in the darkest corners of the souls who dare come too close. It's not the obvious evil, the terror laid bare in traditional vampire tales. No, this is an evil that feeds on doubt, on uncertainty, on vulnerability. An evil that only reveals itself when it's too late, when the prey is already ensnared in its webs of silence. And now, with the discovery of the vampires, it begins to stir again, awakening from the long sleep to which it was confined. In the depths of the mountains, something moves. Something that was never truly dead, only dormant. And as the living try to understand what they've unleashed, the silent evil of the Pieniny begins to spread, seeping into reality without anyone noticing, until it's too late. In the eternal darkness of the Pieniny Mountains, the 450 buried vampires are not just soulless monsters. Among them, there are stories of love that defied the very nature of existence, passions that burned so intensely they could not be extinguished even by death. But with love also came betrayal, a deep scar that still pulses through the centuries. The vampires are not merely predators. They are beings who have lived and loved, hated and been betrayed, trapped in a cycle of emotions that repeat endlessly generation after generation. Immortality, like a sweet poison, has corroded what remained of humanity in many of these beings. Time, which for mortals is a death sentence, has become for them a prison of unfulfilled desire, of lost loves and broken promises. Among the vampires, there are those who, for centuries, walked side by side with their lovers, united not only by a thirst for blood but by a bond that transcends the physical. And yet, this love often turns into a burden, a pain that never ceases, an endless repetition of tragedies. In the depths of the mountains, there are stories of vampires who, in their immortality, swore eternal love. But eternity is not kind to promises made in the heat of the moment. For every couple that has stayed together through the centuries, there is a legion of betrayers, those who, seduced by power and darkness, turned their backs on those they once swore to protect. Immortality exposes the weaknesses of the soul, the imperfections of human feelings, and turns lovers into enemies, allies into rivals. And thus, the cycle of love and betrayal continues, with each generation of vampires reenacting the same dramas, the same failures. There is a palpable sadness that permeates these immortals. They are not creatures insensitive to suffering. On the contrary, they feel each loss, each betrayal with an intensity that humans cannot even imagine. A lover betrayed by another vampire feels that pain not for days or years, but for centuries. It is a wound that does not heal, a constant reminder of the fragility of emotions, even for those who will never die. Immortality, with all its promises of power and dominion, becomes a curse for those forced to relive their failures, their weaknesses, with no end in sight. The lovers among the vampires of Pieniny carry this duality, the desperate hope of finding comfort in eternity and the constant fear of betrayal. Some were betrayed by their own companions, victims of power plays that turned love into a weapon. Others betrayed themselves, yielding to the darkness that slowly consumes every last shred of humanity they had left. And amid this chaos, there are those who continue to love, despite the pain, despite the inevitable fate of losing everything again and again. In the eyes of the vampires, there is a melancholic wisdom. They know that love, as powerful as it is not enough to save them from their nature. They are creatures made of desire, of hunger, and this hunger goes beyond blood. They long for connection, for meaning in a world where time is infinite, but purpose is always fleeting. Each lover, each betrayer, is a living reminder that, as much as immortality gives them power, it also condemns them to solitude, to an endless search for something they can never fully attain: peace. In the Pieniny Mountains, the cold wind whispers the secrets of these immortals. Lovers and betrayers, all of them trapped in an endless cycle, like puppets of a cruel fate. And to those who now walk among their tombs, there is a silent warning: be careful with the bonds you form. In the darkness, love and betrayal are two sides of the same coin, and eternity is far too long to live with regrets. So, have you ever heard of these hidden mysteries about vampires? If you know any interesting stories, share them in the comments. The discovery of the 450 buried vampires in the Pieniny Mountains opened a chasm between modern science and the ancestral legends that dominate the region's culture. The archaeologists and researchers arrived armed with cutting-edge technology, seeking rational answers to what they saw as a historical find. But something didn't add up. The bodies were perfectly preserved, as if time had refused to touch them. No signs of decomposition, as if these beings were somehow still alive. But the questions that arose were greater than any excavation could answer. Science, with all its rigor and rationality, now faced a dilemma that challenged its very foundations. How to explain the inexplicable? The scientists, men and women of cold reasoning, began to hesitate in their conclusions. There was something their instruments couldn't measure, an inexplicable presence. Each night, more team members began having the same strange dreams. And soon it became clear, the 450 vampires were not just history. They were part of the present. The unearthed bones told a story of suffering and fear. Bodies pinned down with stakes through their chests, decapitated heads, and mouths filled with bricks, macabre rituals performed not by barbarians, but by those who feared something more than death. To the scientists, these were signs of ancient burial practices, perhaps a reflection of superstitious beliefs from the past. But the local population knew more. They knew these weren't merely rituals to quell fear, but a desperate attempt to contain something real, something science would never be able to fully comprehend. The scholars faced a challenge that transcended the limits of academic knowledge. Each new discovery seemed to tear the veil of reality, leading them to confront what their skeptical minds had denied for so long. Could it be that these vampire legends were more than simple myths? Could these stories have roots in hidden truths, in a reality that science, with all its objectivity, simply couldn't perceive? This conflict between academic knowledge and local mysticism created a palpable tension. The villagers in the nearby towns observed the archaeologists with skeptical eyes. To them, what the scientists called discoveries were merely confirmations of what they had known for generations. The stories passed down from parents to children were not tales to scare children but warnings to keep evil at bay. Science, with its logical explanations, failed to capture the depth of these legends. The vampires in the Pieniny Mountains were not a metaphor. They were a living presence, an ancient evil that had been tamed only by fear and rituals. As the scientists dug deeper, they found evidence that further shook their beliefs. Reports of missing peasants, bodies found without blood, strange marks on necks, all of this seemed to create a picture that science refused to accept. What machines and instruments couldn't measure, the ancients knew. Myth, the supernatural, the inexplicable, all of it was intertwined in the reality of the Pieniny. And the more the scientists tried to uncover these secrets, the more the myths seemed to rise, challenging every attempt at explanation. The real clash between science and myth was not just academic, it was a struggle for power. Science sought to dominate, categorize, put everything into organized boxes, while myth resisted, nebulous, fluid, a living force that could not be controlled. What the archaeologists didn't realize, however, was that their own interference was awakening what had long been silent. Each discovery, each analysis, was like a key turning in the lock of a door that should never have been opened. In the end, the conflict between science and myth in the Pieniny Mountains was not a battle that could be won. Science, with all its precision, was confronting the limits of its own understanding, and myth, with all its imprecision and mystery, proved to be more resilient than any logical explanation. What remained was a simple yet terrifying question. What if the myth is real? What if what science calls superstition is, in fact, the only truth that matters? As the investigations continued, something began to happen to those who ventured too deep into the Pieniny Mountains. Reality, once solid and unwavering, began to distort, to slowly crumble. For the scientists, it started with small lapses, peripheral visions, shadows that shouldn't be there, whispers in the wind that weren't carried by any breeze. At first, These occurrences were dismissed as hallucinations caused by exhaustion. But as the days passed, the boundaries between what was real and what was not began to dissolve. What once seemed safe, science, logic, order, began to lose meaning in the face of the unknown. For those who lived near the mountains, this was a familiar story. What the scientists called lapses in perception, they knew to be the influence of the awakened vampires, immortal spirits that toyed with the minds of the living. The legends had always warned of this power. Vampires not only fed on blood, but also on reality itself. They distorted mortal perception, playing with emotions and desires until what was solid began to dissolve and what was impossible became inescapably real. The nights in the Pieniny grew longer. The scientists, who once trusted in their technology and tools, began to doubt their own senses. Equipment failed without reason. Cameras captured images that made no sense, nebulous forms, indistinct figures moving in the dark, as if the shadows had a life of their own. The hours seemed to stretch, distorting into an endless dance of confusion and uncertainty. Slowly, they realized they were no longer in control. Something older, more powerful, was shaping the very structure of reality around them. Among the archaeologists, reports of disturbing dreams emerged, shared by many, as if they were all connected by an invisible thread. In these visions, they walked through a world that was not their own, a place of living shadows where the mountains breathed and the dead walked among the living. Some began to lose track of time, forgetting when they had arrived or how long it had been since the start of the excavation. The earth itself seemed to have its own consciousness, a malicious presence that surrounded them. The villagers watched from a distance, but they knew that the line between myth and reality was disintegrating. For them, this was no surprise. The mountains had always been known to test the sanity of those who dared to delve too deeply into their mysteries. Legend spoke of travelers who disappeared, never to be seen again, of hunters who returned as shadows of who they once were, with empty eyes and souls trapped somewhere between the world of the living and the dead. The most frightening thing, however, was that the vampires themselves, once confined to darkness, seemed to be materializing at the edges of reality, not as physical monsters, but as a presence that hovered over every thought, every breath. What was real, and what was a product of disturbed minds? It was impossible to know. The immortals, as the legend said, didn't need bodies to influence the world of the living. They manipulated the very fabric of reality, turning dreams into nightmares and certainties into doubts. And so, reality began to unravel slowly, like a veil being lifted to reveal something much darker. In the heart of the Pieniny Mountains, the line between the possible and the impossible disappeared. And those who dared to dig deeper into the graves of the 450 vampires now found themselves trapped in a labyrinth where reality was no longer a reliable anchor. They had awakened something they didn't understand, and now, caught in a web of illusions, they were about to discover that the greatest truths were not what they could see or touch, but what they could not escape. In the depths of the Pieniny Mountains, where shadows dance with eternal darkness, the final choice always falls to those who dare to face the unknown. The discovery of the 450 vampires had revealed something much deeper than ancient bones or forgotten rituals. The true mystery lay not only in the bodies, but in the invisible forces governing reality and the souls of those who still breathed. Now, faced with the abyss between what is real and what cannot be understood, one question remains. What do we do when confronted with the truth? Those who unearthed the mountain's secret now found themselves at a crossroads. Science and logic, which had guided their steps until then, were useless in the face of what rose from the shadows. The legends proved more powerful than any historical fact, more alive than any modern theory. The vampires were not merely myths, they were reflections of the human condition itself, beings trapped between two worlds, between life and death, between desire and darkness. And this duality revealed the true dilemma: to free oneself or to be lost forever. Each character, each individual involved in this discovery, was confronted with a silent choice. Liberation didn't simply mean escaping the mountains, but freeing oneself from the fear of the unknown, from the attachment to the tangible. For those who were still alive, to be free meant embracing the mystery, accepting that not everything could be explained or controlled by reason. But there was a price. By accepting what could not be seen, they had to abandon the security of logic, of sanity. The choice of liberation was a descent into a world where what is real and what is myth merge, and where who we are is shaped by what we fear. But, for many, the easier choice was to forget what they had seen, to bury again what they had unearthed, and to pretend that the past had never risen from the graves. Forgetting was tempting, a promise that they could return to their normal lives, that the terror of Pieniny was just a passing shadow. But reality, as they had learned, is never so kind. Forgetting was not a true solution, only a way to get lost in their own illusions. Once darkness is awakened, it never returns to its silent slumber. It always waits, patiently, on the edge of consciousness, ready to claim what belongs to it. Among the vampires, the choice between liberation and forgetting was equally cruel. For them, liberation meant giving up eternity, the power that immortality granted them, and finally embracing death, the last frontier. But this also meant losing control over their destinies, accepting that their stories, with all their betrayals and lost loves, would come to an end. Forgetting, on the other hand, offered the promise of a continuous cycle, where the same passions and pains would be relived, never truly resolved. A vicious cycle where immortality became a prison of endless repetition. The true question that permeates this story, and resonates in the minds of those who dared to explore the secrets of Pieniny, is this: what does it mean to be immortal? Is eternity a blessing, an infinite time to discover the meaning of existence? Or is it a curse, an endless repetition of the same mistakes, the same losses, without the final release of death? Each viewer, each mind following this journey, is challenged to find their own answer. Perhaps true freedom lies neither in eternal life nor in death, but in accepting that some questions have no answers. The silence that now hovers over the Pieniny Mountains is different. It's not the empty silence of ignorance, but the weight of an ancient secret that, once revealed, can never be forgotten. The vampires, with their eternal eyes and souls marked by time, watch from a distance, waiting, perhaps, for those who will choose to face them. The choice between liberation or forgetting is not just an individual decision but a mirror reflecting the dilemma of all humanity. Do we continue to fight against the unknown, or do we accept our own fragility before it? As the mountains remain imposing, like guardians of unshakable secrets, the fate of all, mortal and immortal, intertwines in a fabric of mystery and despair. The end? It is never final. Just as the vampires continue to exist between life and death, so too does the enigma of Pieniny remain. The answer, like the darkness itself, will continue waiting, in silence, in the shadows, ready to be challenged again by those brave enough to ask. But remember, there are questions that, once asked, change forever those who dare to ask them. Thank you for watching until the end. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving the next videos. Here on this channel, we will have a series of videos on enigmatic mysteries like this one.